Firstly, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar today. So my name's Huw Davies. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO at Ozone API. I'll be hosting the session today. I'm delighted to be joined by Lorraine Mouat from Thistle. So Thistle, if you're not aware, they're I guess the leading practitioners and brains and experts in the world of regulatory compliance for financial services, and Lorraine leads the payment compliance practice. So Lorraine, welcome. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Huw. Nice to be here.
And we've got Ryan Waters. Ryan's the senior product manager at a company called Ozone API, which if you haven't heard of, we help banks and financial institutions all around the world deliver their open banking and open finance APIs, but also verification of payee and other such services in various different markets around the world. And Ryan is our internal super expert. So delighted to be joined by you two as well, Ryan. So
lovely to meet everyone.
So just to set the scene for today. So obviously verification of payee is a real hot topic in Europe at the moment. So what we're aiming to do is spend the next sort of 25, 30 minutes sort of working through the what, the when, and the how with Ryan and Lorraine. And we've already been gathering a number of questions from participants. And there's tools within the webinar as well. There's a Q&A section, which you can find in the bottom right, where you can add questions. So we'll work through, as I say, the what, the when, and the how, and then we'll make sure we try and work through as many of the questions as we can. So please do keep them coming in. But for now, let's get started with the what. So Lorraine, I wonder if you can start us off with just talking about what is verification of payee? What's it designed to do?
Absolutely, Huw, no problem at all. So verification of payee, it's basically a critical security and compliance measure, which is used in banking just to ensure that money is sent to the intended recipient. So it works by matching the name provided by the payer during any particular transaction with the name registered to the recipient's bank account. And if there's a mismatch, then the system alerts the user with the expectation that that's going to help reduce the risk of fraud and also human error in payment processes. So it was introduced by the European Payments Council. They proactively looking to enhance the payment security by introducing this verification of payee scheme through their rule book, which will be effective from October this year, of course, which mandates VOP services for both instant and regular SIPA credit transfers. And again, aiming just to provide real-time verification to prevent fraud. So it provides that sort of, there's a match, there's a close match, or there's no match, and everything has got to happen within this very quick 5-second loop, of course, which is going to leave very little room for error on the banking side, and also introduces probably a little bit more, I guess, of an issue when we're looking at bulk files, and particularly something maybe we can speak to later. So in a nutshell, it's a fraud prevention measure. Really, it's going to help ensure payments go to the intended recipient by checking that the account names are all matching up, etc. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Perfect. Thanks, Lorraine. And Ryan, it is a hot topic at the minute. So why is that? What's going on? Why is this so time critical right now?
I think in short, as Lorraine mentioned, the reason it is a really hot topic at the moment is, of course, this looming regulatory deadline for PSPs of October 9th. The EPC actually predicts that there's between 2,500 to 3,000 PSPs that fall in scope of this requirement to provide a VOP service as part of the instant payments regulation. So that kind of gives you an idea of the scale of the challenge that the PSPs have to meet, and the amount of PSPs that are all trying to kind of get in the door at once, if you like. The EPC are only really starting to onboard PSPs onto the VOP scheme this month, and they're doing that in kind of a series of what they're calling adherence waves. The first one of which has, I think, now just opened. So that kind of gives you a sense of the the amount there is for a very large number of PSPs to do in a relatively small amount of time that they have to do it. The other one, of course, is the scale of the application to the PSP themselves. I mean, any time that a PSP either receives a SEPA payment or makes a SEPA payment, these VOT requirements are going to apply, and it's going to become a kind of a key part of the user journey for end customers. So, you know, any issue with implementation could potentially lead to customer dissatisfaction. Also, you know, if certain PSPs do not have as good a VOP implementation of others, then there's a kind of an increased risk for push payment fraud. And you know, this is all sort of fitting in with the wider context of instant payments becoming a lot more prevalent, and the need to kind of make instant payments as secure as possible now that they're becoming kind of mandated EU wide. So there's really there's a lot for PSPs to do in a short space of time, is the kind of the meat and bones of it.
I mean, again, just thinking about those numbers of PSPs that you talked about and the amount of change that needs to be delivered and the amount of time between now and October, this does feel pretty tight. But no, thank you. And Lorraine, I wondered, do you think there are sort of particular sectors or fraud hotspots or areas where this will benefit most and have the biggest impact?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the actual sectors that it's going to impact, you know, any payment service provider that's offering SEPA credit transfers, banks, retail and corporate, perhaps there's fintech companies, corporate payment hubs, perhaps even routing and verification mechanisms also going to play like a critical role, particularly in facilitating compliance for the PSPs, offering those solutions that handle the name matching and verification processes. I think really any sort of terms of transactions, any large one-off payments are going to be prime targets for fraud. So I think that's where it's going to come into its own. So high value, high volume type transactions where it would be beneficial to have those extra checks, and particularly before there's any sort of bulk payments being sent as well. I think that the dates for the point of view of implementation and compliance, like you've just mentioned, are going to be super tight. We've got a very small window whereby payment service providers have got to have their systems ready to connect with the EPC's directory service. We've then really only got a couple of months where they've got to test and be live and operational for handling those transfers. So I think, you know, there's many sectors here that really need to think carefully and get a wiggle on in terms of being prepared for all of that.
Yeah, and I mean, as we all know with fraud, right, it always goes towards the weakest link or the weakest area, which is why it's so important that the entire industry moves at the same time with implementation and verification of payee. But yeah, lots to do in a short amount of time. But verification of payee in Europe, this isn't the first time it's been done. Ryan, I wonder if you can sort of reflect a little bit on what similar initiatives have we seen in other markets around the world?
Yeah, well, just to touch first on verification of payee in Europe. So I mean, it's certainly not a new thing in Europe, verification of payee. I guess the core difference here is that there is now an EU-wide regulatory mandate, and also within the context of that, a common specification that's going to kind of help support interoperability. But you know, there's been a local national scheme for verification of payee, I think in the Netherlands as far back as 2017. So you know, really verification of payee certainly isn't new in Europe, but this regulatory mandate is definitely represents a massive kind of step change. I think a lot, like globally, a lot of regions are kind of looking to catch up to the UK, which is kind of like under the PSRs is kind of probably the only kind of regulatory mandated national scheme that's kind of truly live and in force at the moment. I mean, globally, you've got places like the UAE, New Zealand, Australia, that are all kind of at various stages of like a phased rollout. But really, the confirmation of payee scheme in the UK is kind of the one that's that's very much kind of leading the charge. And I think certainly in the context of the instant payment regulations, the EU have looked at that and said, well, we need to make verification of payee a kind of a part of a EU-wide mandated verification of payee scheme, kind of a core part of those instant payments regulations.
Yeah, and so when it comes to the scheme, what is different in Europe?
So I guess there's a few things that are different in Europe versus, for example, the UK. I mean, the EPC even decided to call it something different, verification rather than confirmation of payee. The fundamental kind of aim with all of these schemes is the same, right? It's to prevent fraud and misdirected payments via kind of confirming the payee account ownership in advance of any payment being made. Really, the big difference with the EU, other than the kind of the more technical aspects, is kind of the size of the market and the interoperability challenge there. There are certain differences. For example, the core kind of underlying thing that's being kind of used for the matching check here as an IBAN rather than the sort code and account number in the UK context. The way the matching report works is also a little bit different. The UK has this kind of slightly richer, more granular set of reason codes that are supposed to be responded back to the requesting PSP when they request a verification of payee check. The other thing is the directory and the kind of the routing and access model is a little bit different in Europe in comparison to the UK. In the UK, PSPs and banks pretty much outsource everything to an aggregator who kind of accesses the scheme entirely on their behalf, whereas in the context of VOP, basically all of the PSPs need to be listed as scheme participants on the EPC directory, even if they're using something like an RVM in the background to manage that integration and to manage routing and verifications in the context of an end-to-end VOP request. So the schemes are kind of more similar than they are different. But yeah, there are a few kind of key differences that are outlined there.
Thanks, Ryan. And as ever, there's always a whole library full of acronyms. So we'll get into what is an RVM in a little bit more detail in a moment. But let's just again just sort of focus in and create clarity on who falls under this, who needs to comply, and what do they need to do, Lorraine?
Okay, so in terms of who needs to comply, it's pretty much all payment service providers. So all payment service providers have got to be able to offer VOP for SEPA credit transfers, as I've said, to the end users. Also banks, retail, commercial, corporate have got to provide the VOP checks to customers when initiating SEPA credit transfers. We've got payment institutions that also must implement those VOP capabilities, e-money institutions, and indirect PSP. So even if they don't settle directly, if they offer SEPA payments to users, then they're going to have to comply. The other thing to think about is it applies both on the payer side, PSP sending the payments, and the payee side, PSP responding to the VOP check. So both play a part in that clearly. It's mandatory for IBAN-based payments within SEPA. And whilst non-EU PSPs are not required to implement VOP unless they operate through the EU branches subject to EU PSD2, like we just discussed there, we've got the kind of UK version of COP anyway, so it's very, very similar. In terms of, I think, what that's really going to look like, apart from the obvious of a significant reduction in impersonation fraud, I think it's going to become a bit of a standard expectation for all SEPA account holders. Expansion perhaps beyond SEPA, the potential future application to cross-border and non-euro payments perhaps. The confirmation of Payee, as I've just mentioned, I think there could be greater integration with that. So I think there's a bit of a pressure to align those more closely as firms. Well, a lot of firms operate across regions, across borders, so it makes perfect sense. But as just been discussed, they're very similar, but not exactly the same. So I think there is, again, that kind of push for a harmonized infrastructure, so that interoperability, which has been mentioned across PSPs, centralized vault registries, may actually start to emerge, and I think they possibly could be used going forward as a bit of a benchmark for due diligence, especially under PSD3 and the changing AML regulations. So definitely going to set the groundwork for a more secure, consistent and sort of transparent payments landscape, I think.
Yeah, and definitely interesting around what may come after this sort of baseline is set. But I guess the kind of the key immediate conclusion now is, if you're a PSP, you've got to do this, and it's got to be done by October. So let's get into the weeds a little more. Perhaps Ryan, can you kind of help us understand, how does it work? What does a verification of payee request look like? What's going on behind the scenes? Maybe you can bring that to life a little.
Sure. I guess kind of, as we've already touched upon, every payee verification kind of has a payer's PSP and a payee's PSP sitting at either side. And then you have kind of the EPC API is what's providing this kind of common standardized format for requests and responses within the flow. And kind of this is how kind of interoperability is achieved. Is the EPC directory, and on that EPC directory of all of the PSPs, irrespective of kind of the context of whether they're requesting or they're responding, all the PSPs will have their routing information listed on the directory. So, you know, in a kind of a standard flow, a requesting PSP is going to kind of receive the information on the transaction from the user. They're going to use the payee bank details to look up the BIC of the responding PSP in the EDS in the directory, and then that responding PSP will have pretty much the URI of their responding service detailed on that directory, that the requesting PSP can then use to initiate the vault check. So when the responding PSP receives that request, depending on how they're kind of set up and whether or not they're using something like an RVM, which I'll get onto in a second, that responding PSP is going to take the information on the payee details that they received from the requester, namely the IBAN and the name that's provided by the payer as to who they want to pay. They're going to effectively look that up in their system of record, find the name information that they have that they have in their systems, and whether or not that's a business name, or the name of an individual, or it's possibly a business identifier like a VAT code, LEI, a tax code. These are all things that can be used under the scheme to perform a match check. Lorraine, I think, already briefly mentioned the possible outcomes around the matching process. Effectively, it's a yes, no, close match, or a not applicable check. I.e., if for whatever reason the IBAN can't be found, something like its account's closed or the account's switched, something along those lines. So the scenarios for kind of when you can and cannot generate a no match response or a close match response is something that the EPC have kind of provided fairly extensive guidance on. Just as a very random example, if the account the account details on record are James Smith and the payer is trying to pay J Smith, then that's a classic example of a context where you would provide a close match response. And in the context of a close match response, the intention with that close match is to also provide the actual name details held on file by the responding PSP, by the payee's PSP. Our RVMs really come into this in the sense that any PSP that wants to comply and wants to be able to perform VOP requests or VOP responses can use an RVM as a kind of an integration partner, as a middleman between the requester and the responder to support on the processing of the VOP check, right? So RVM stands for routing and verification mechanism. So you can kind of think about those two things individually. Routing, first of all, you are taking in a request from a requesting PSP and you're supporting in the routing of the request to the correct responder. And in the context of a verification, you might be intercepting the public VOP request from a third-party VOP requester, contacting the VOP responder, generating the verification report using the name you've received from the third-party VOP requester against the name that's held on record by the VOP responder. So RVMs can, of course, support on routing as mentioned, but they can also support on the verification, the actual generation of these matching reports. And the intention of having RVMs really is to help simplify the integration requirements for any PSP that needs to comply.
Fantastic, thank you, Ryan. And there was an awful lot in that. So if there's interest in following up, then please do get in touch. We can talk you through the process. We've got one-pagers that outline what's happening. Shorthand though, RVM basically handles the heavy lifting, so the PSP can participate and deliver, but they don't have to do everything themselves. Is that fair enough?
Very, very much so. Yeah, I think RVMs are there so that the PSP just has to integrate with the RVM and work with the RVM rather than having to worry about integration with 3,000 other PSPs across the SEPA scheme, right?
Exactly right. Thank you. And Max, speeding up through the last few sections so we can make sure we give ourselves time for some of the questions that are coming in. But Lorraine, is there kind of overlap and crossover between verification of pay and the broader sort of landscape of existing and incoming regulation in Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me make this super quick then. There's definitely a crossover with a number of regulations, PSD2, PSD3, particularly building on that strong customer authentication and strengthening fraud. The instant payments regulation, so the VOP is mandatory under the IPR for Euro instant payments, effective from October this year. The 5 AMLD, 6 AMLD, anti-money laundering regulations, of course, helping for fraud detection. We've also got data protection, GDPR, since of course it involves the processing of personal data, names and accounts numbers. It's all got to be privacy by design, by default, and data minimization. And also the other one I would consider would be DORA, where the VOP systems have got to be considered as surely critical ICT infrastructure for payment service providers. So in a nutshell, they would be the key ones that I would cite.
Thank you. I mean, there's always a complex spider web, right, of overlapping regulations. But yeah, with so much coming, that makes sense. And I guess there were a lot of considerations around how to implement. What are some of the things that PSPs in Europe can learn from the implementation of confirmation of payee in the UK, Lorraine?
Yeah, so really important and really interesting. This, I think, you know, and there was an initial limitation with the confirmation of Payee where it was just first mandatory for only the sort of 6 largest banking groups. Lesson learned there. The fraudsters just migrated to smaller PSPs, not offering that, and created a bit of a weak link and vulnerabilities. So I guess, you know, just make sure it's much more widely implemented. I think there was also in the early days a bit of a struggle with some false negatives. So legit payments were actually being flagged. So I think, again, the solution to that would better name matching algorithms perhaps, and guidance on acceptable variations. So you need to sort of clearly define that match criteria and customer messaging standards, I guess. There were, I think, some confusion around some of the warnings, like name doesn't match, without perhaps some clear next steps. So I guess the takeaway for that is to design proper prompts and education around it. It's critical for users. They need clear, actionable guidance when any type of discrepancy, arise. I think also the COP's success relied a lot on cross-industry coordination via Pay UK and open banking. So I think for VOP to scale effectively, industry bodies and standard organisations and regulators really got to align on not just the technical, but the operational and the governance framework. So quite a few things they can learn from that, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. And just sharing a sort of personal perspective, I think one of the really powerful things is there's a common mandate across the entire market. So we're not going to have all of this staged implementation that can make it harder for people to understand what's going on. But I think one of the things that we probably all saw in the UK, user experience is really important. These things can be done very well or very badly. And we saw this with open banking at the beginning as well. You need good user experience guidelines and done in a way that gives customers comfort without unnecessarily scaring them and helps prompt them through the process in the right way. So yeah, I think there are some real learnings from the UK. I guess one of the considerations as well, Ryan, is on the technical and implementation side for the banks and the PSPs. What do you think are the biggest sort of technical and operational considerations they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I would say probably there's kind of the short-term view and there's the long-term view. In the short-term view, PSPs really need to be thinking about are they going to build this themselves, or are they going to engage with a partner, somebody like an RVM, to help them on the implementation. You know, the working with an RVM has a lot of potential for PSPs to reduce implementation complexity, especially, you know, if you're working with an RVM that's providing additional features, fraud risk indicators, things along those lines. In the longer term, I really think that, yeah, PSPs need to be thinking about kind of future iterations of the scheme and kind of associated infrastructure and rules. And it's highly likely that the service will evolve over time. One example is that as security requirements evolve, I mean, the underlying way that the directory and that the scheme is running from a kind of a trust framework perspective at the moment is PSD2 QAC certificates, but that certainly could evolve, or there could be additional security requirements. Also, the specs themselves absolutely may change over time, and then that becomes kind of an operational consideration for PSPs around how are they going to maintain alignment with the specs and standards. There could again be future regulatory drives around, for example, you guys have already touched upon the user experience. That these things are likely to happen, yeah, iteratively in phases, and PSPs definitely need to kind of be cognizant of how much they want to expose themselves to risks associated with maintaining that compliance.
Yeah, again, I think it's another area where there were quite a lot of parallels with what we saw with open banking. I think we've seen in many markets now quite often the self-build route can lead to a level of regret because frankly there's a lot of complexity in doing this, and as you say, it doesn't stay still. The frameworks, the standards continue to change, which is why business like ours have emerged to provide that sort of specialist platform to take away the heavy lifting. Let's just for the last couple of minutes before we dive into some of the audience questions as well. Let's just sort of have a little look beyond this initial implementation. So I'll perhaps ask you both, maybe Lorraine to start, but what more can banks and PSPs be thinking about beyond just this initial implementation of verification of payee? What are some of the things on your mind?
Yeah, okay, so I think the BOP's a key tool, but it's most certainly not what I would call a silver bullet. It's only one piece of the fraud prevention puzzle, really. And I think to truly fight fraud and keep that customer trust, there's got to be a few complementary measures in place. So, you know, we know that fraudsters often operate across multiple platforms and various jurisdictions. So I think one of the key actions would really be to enable real-time privacy conscious intelligence sharing. I think sharing data is key here between the banks, fintechs, law enforcement, to just identify and help block those fraud patterns. Many scams we know still succeed due to a bit of social engineering, not necessarily system failures. So perhaps by launching coordinated campaigns to educate consumers, we talk a lot about this fraud prevention, on common scam tactics, impersonation, investment fraud, and then just how BOP fits into that prevention, of course, has to be considered. Perhaps investing in behavioural analytics and AI. We talk a lot about AI in business now. We know that sophisticated fraudsters often bypass basic controls. So perhaps using machine learning, behavioural biometrics to flag unusual activity, sort of changes in transaction speed, amount, login patterns, whatever it may be. But one thing is for sure, fraud does not respect borders. So the big thing for me is the need to work towards a harmonised fraud prevention regulation more globally, and certainly across you know, between UK, EU. So maybe linking BOP with EIDAS 2.0, digital wallets, and trying to close any sort of international loopholes, I think would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, this is part of the fabric of fraud prevention. It's not the complete answer. I'm sure we all know, I mean, I certainly have friends who've been caught out by some of the social engineering, even when, say, confirmation of payee was in place. Right, interested in your thoughts. Any additions?
Well, I think Lorraine's covered it really, really well there. But I think with authorized push payment fraud in particular, a lot of these new scams now are originating on social media channels, and you know it's difficult for banks to kind of directly influence this without the support of government. But I certainly think you know, PSPs and banks can do more to make customers aware of these common sorts of scams and how they originate, particularly on the social media platforms, because that's one of the big drivers for authorized push payment scams at the moment. Lorraine mentioned investment scams. Yeah, better awareness of how these things originate, particularly on social media, I think is a very critical one.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's an ongoing industry responsibility, right? But so I guess a final question for you both. So what's the one piece of advice you'd give to any financial institution starting on this journey, other than obviously get in touch with Thistle and Ozone API? What would be the one piece of advice that you'd suggest? Lorraine, let's start with you.
Okay, absolutely. Start with the end in mind. design your VOP journey around the customer, not necessarily compliance. Of course, it's got to be compliant, but think about your customer. I think very, very often as a compliance consultant, we see firms focusing on just ticking, I hate to use this phrase, but let's just use it, ticking those regulatory boxes and implementing anything as a bit of a technical afterthought, whereas the real value here lies in how you're going to protect your customers and how you're going to build trust in that payment experience. So that means making the VOP checks fast, clear, as frictionless as possible, communicating results in plain language, like I mentioned earlier, make sure it's clear in terms of what the message you're trying to get across, help customers understand why a payment's been flagged and what they need to do next, because it's not, ultimately it's about preventing fraud, but it's also just about making every payment feel safer. So if you lead with that in mind, you not only just meet the requirements, but you're going to potentially differentiate your brand as well. So a lot of positive branding here as well.
Fantastic. That's some great advice. And Ryan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess to kind of touch upon the Lorraine's sort of angle around the customer experience, I would say for PSPs, it's definitely important to understand how does VOP apply to you. You know, what payment channels are you processing potentially VOP applicable payments on? What payment types? What types of account are you going to need to be able to perform matching checks on? Understand not only the high level scope of VOP, but the specific application to your operations as a PSP. On a more practical lens, every PSP needs to submit adherence onboarding documentation to the EPC. This is all publicly available online, and it's pretty easy and simple to complete these steps. So I would massively encourage PSPs to look at those onboarding documents and get those processed. Likewise,
Ryan, just on that, is there a deadline when they've got to get that done by?
I think the deadline is fast approaching. I think it may be mid-May, but yeah, I'm not certain. I'm pretty sure it's mid-May to get those adherence documents processed. The other thing that you kind of need as a baseline for interacting in the scheme is a PSD2 QAC certificate. So for any PSP that perhaps doesn't have a PSD2 QAC certificate or doesn't have a lot of context on what that is, then speak to any partners you have, work out exactly how you are going to identify yourself to other scheme participants. Lastly, I would say in the context of kind of all of these kind of technical considerations, you speak to an RVM, absolutely. The EPC is publishing a list of basically scheme approved RVMs on their public site. So have a look at that site, and definitely get in touch with some RVMs as a priority, especially if you are considering using an integration partner.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. And of course, it goes without saying, and I'd be slapped if I didn't say this, then of course you can get in touch with Ozone API and Thistle to help you through this. So thank you. I think it's really, really interesting perspectives there. Now, one of the things we asked was whether any of the attendees had questions prior to joining, and we got a good list of them, as well as some questions that have been emerging as we've been going through the webinar. So we're at the point where I might completely expose my lack of ability to multitask, because I've got a few documents going on with various different questions. So bear with me as we try and work through some of the attendee questions. So one of them was, are there any best practices that we share from confirmation of payee? Now, I think, Lorraine, you talk through that in terms of what are some of the learnings from confirmation of payee. Perhaps, Ryan, I'll just ask you briefly, is there anything you think worth mentioning that we didn't cover earlier?
I mean, I guess one of the things is the setup of the COP scheme was a little bit different, and by and large, pretty much every PSP, every bank that fell within scope of the COP requirements was using an aggregator, was using a partner that was a member of the scheme, and they were just participating indirectly, particularly all of the tier twos. So again, this is the risk of sounding like a bit of a sales pitch. Pretty much all of the tier two PSPs in the UK went with an integration partner. So in terms of like the build or buy conversation, it definitely lends itself more towards buy than build.
Particularly given the timescales and the amount of complexity to deal with. Yeah. There was a question specifically around what's the Ozone API pricing for this. We will be very happy to share. Please do get in touch afterwards and we can provide much more detail around the platform. There was a question around how does this help solve account push payment fraud. So again, I think we covered that a moment ago in that the matching helps reduce some of the potential frauds through either incorrect input or people being encouraged to send money to an account that doesn't belong to the person they think they're sending it to. But Lorraine really articulately covered how this is just part of the overall fabric of solving APP fraud. But one question, which again, there's perhaps a bit of a risk of repetition, but specific question around the benefits of using an RVM. So I think you've touched on that, Ryan, but kind of if you were to sort of land a sort of one sentence version, what would that be?
I think that the main benefit of using an RVM is that the RVM will do all of the heavy lifting of delivering things like the public EPC specification and adherence to that, integration to the EDS, to the EPC's directory service. Really the only requirement for any PSP that's going to be working directly with an RVM is to integrate with that RVM. So you kind of take the regulatory burden off your hands for sure. And yeah, because you know the RVMs can access the directory on your behalf. They can do routing on your behalf, depending on your kind of setup and how you want to manage it. RVMs can also do verification reports. Really, it's taking a lot of the build out of the hands of PSPs, and likewise the ongoing maintenance.
Yeah, and within that build, and again, there's been questions around build versus buy. There's obviously building all of the matching logic and making sure all of the responses are correct and everything's built to the standards and keeps up to date with them as they change. On the build versus buy, any other points that you'd particularly draw out? I mean, there's complexity and very, very narrow timescales, but any other points you'd draw out?
Yeah, maybe just to mention around the actual generation of the verification reports. You know, the matching outcomes. This is probably the in a lot of ways it's the most kind of technically complex part of the solution, and also, you know, the way that a PSP might want to do matching is to a certain extent dependent on their risk appetite. But the good thing here is that the EPC has published a fairly extensive paper on in their interpretations and recommendations around how they think matching should be done. You know, in particular around the context under which you should generate a close match or a no match response, and kind of our solution with regards to that matching process is pretty much to go compliance first and make sure that we're adhering to that EPC that EPC guidance in really detailed view.
Oh, fantastic, thank you. And I guess so. I think there's probably one more question that's worth on the list that was sent previously that I don't think we covered. It might be worth summarising. So just again, if I'm a PSP, what are the steps I need to be taking now to make sure I meet the deadline?
So I would say right now the two most important things are getting the onboarding documents over to the EPC, and ultimately also deciding on whether you're going to work with an RVM or do it in-house. And if you are going to work with an RVM, it now really is the time to start formalizing a relationship with that RVM, because the EPC is already now starting to invite PSPs to onboard onto the directory. That's going to happen in various waves. The first one starts, as mentioned, this month. There's another one in, I believe, beginning of July, and then another one in September. And the PSPs that fall into the later waves are definitely at risk of missing that October deadline. So the quicker that a PSP can kind of get set up with the EPC, and then with an RVM perhaps, the quicker they can get onto the directory and hopefully meet the deadline.
Can I also just quickly add as well, I think one of the key steps is to understand where that regulation actually applies, because I think there's often confusion, particularly if you're sitting outside of the EU but operating within the EU. So I think the first step would really be to understand the regulatory requirements and how it applies to you. I think there's also a job to be done to assess your existing systems and capabilities, so that you know, if anything, what you need to be doing differently that you're not doing already, and updating any of your data security sort of processes, controls, etc. Clearly, you want to plan for integration with any third parties that you may be relying on to help you do that. So I think there's a lot of considerations ahead of actually going ahead and putting pen to paper, so to speak, including thinking about your customer comms and other types of documentation.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. And again, the conclusion I think we keep coming to, there's an awful lot to do without a huge amount of time, and this is pretty specialist stuff. So there probably isn't time to waste. You should get moving now. A couple of questions on the online Q&A from Paul. One was around, will the presentation be available later for viewing? Absolutely. So we've recorded and we'll make that available. And perhaps this might be one for you, Lorraine. So does the requirement of VOP apply to European IBAN account holders? For example, if I want to set up a payment with new payment details of a new payer who has an IBAN in another non-UK institution, will this requirement feature of VOP work?
Yes. So if I'm understanding the question, it would apply to European IBAN holders when the payment involves a payment account within the UK or the EEA region. I think that's already part of the PSD regulations, which requires verification of the payer's identity for certain types of payments. So I think specifically VOP is applicable for third-party payments, payment initiations, where the service is used to initiate payments on behalf of the payer in Europe. So I think that when they're initiating a payment from a non-UK European IBAN, then you've got to make sure that you still verify the payer's identity and account ownership as part of that process. So I think basically if you're working with European customers, clients, or cross-border payments in that way, I would say that it applies to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So we've got through all of the questions, and Ryan, Lorraine, I want to say a huge thank you for bringing such in-depth expertise to the discussion. Again, just to summarize again, I think there's a significant deadline coming up. There's a lot to do. this is complex stuff. So definitely, if you haven't started moving yet, now is the time. Thistle are the experts in regulatory compliance advice. So again, if you've got questions, Lorraine's a good person to reach out to, and at Ozone API, yeah, we can help with the technical solution and to help you as an RVM. So again, the team are here and ready to move as fast as you need to. But to everyone that's joined, a huge thank you. Lorraine and Ryan, a huge thank you, and have a great rest of the day, everyone.